Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie. This is just a different kind of episode. There's a lot weighing on my mind at the moment, specifically after watching the documentary series, the 4-part documentary series, Quiet on the Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV. There were allegations coming out in recent years. The documentary delves deeply into all of this. So first off, I've talked about, obviously, in several podcast episodes, I loved Nickelodeon as a kid, and I revisit these shows to this day, and it's stuff I fondly remember watching as a kid. And there were these allegations that were coming out in recent years, specifically geared towards Dan Schneider. So seeing these former employees coming forward, talking about their experiences, it shines a light on, fortunately that it's seeing the light of day, that people are coming forward with their stories, but unfortunately that it's not an exception, it's a pattern in not just Hollywood, but in other institutions where predators protect other predators and that they know how to manipulate people. It's really heartbreaking, and it makes it that much more difficult for people to not only believe victims that went through these traumatic experiences, but for them to speak up and be heard, and for it to not happen again in the future. And I was reading things like articles about this documentary leading up to it, and as a fan of these shows, The Amanda Show, I was a huge fan of The Amanda Show as a kid. Like, as a kid, I wanted to be friends with Amanda Bynes. And then obviously we saw in more recent years the struggles she went through, in particular with her mental health. And then, of course, there was Jeanette McCurdy's memoir, I'm Glad My Mom Died, which I also read. It took me several months to finally buy it because it was sold out for several months, and good for her that she was able to put her story out there on her own path to healing, coming forward with the abuse she went through, namely with her mother, but also highlighting the experiences of the shows she worked on Nickelodeon, in particular iCarly and Sam and Cat, who she calls the creator in her book, who we all know is Dan Schneider. It's truly so heartbreaking that predators enable this behavior because making them money. Like, another example, for instance, is Danny Masterson, who has since been convicted of rape and is in prison, but he was protected by Scientology. And then obviously it came to light that Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher had written character letters defending Danny Masterson. So similarly, obviously with this documentary, how Brian Peck, a convicted pedophile at the time, had manipulated people and got so much support on his side and had a total of, there were 41 people who had written character reference letters in favor of him to the judge. And that's so disgusting. And so the big story, one of the biggest stories that came to light through this documentary, was that Drake Bell was sexually assaulted repeatedly by Brian Peck, who worked on these shows. And then he was convicted. He went to prison for 16 months, and then he ended up working at the Disney Channel. That said, though, that does not at all negate that, tragically, Drake Bell went on to also engage in predatory and abusive behavior toward underage girls. This is similar, I can't help but make the connection also, to the co-creator of Rick and Morty, Justin Roiland. You could look all of that up if you're not familiar, but the long and short of it is that he also, for years, was grooming minors and exploiting their desire for wanting to get into the animation industry, in that case, and like saying he'll look at their drawings, whatever it may be, and then grooming them to get what he wants out of them, in particular to have a threesome, whatever it is. There's so many. You can look online if you're not familiar with that, and if you'd like to learn more. People had come forward who were groomed by Justin Roiland. That's just another example that I'm making the connection with in this case. So similarly, tragically, Drake Bell was on that path. in his past. And he did address it briefly toward the end of the documentary and said he took responsibility for that. So sadly, it's a cycle of abuse. It's really tragic. And so we have that predatory behavior. There was also another instance where they discussed another pedophile, Jason Handy, who sent, as the mother of one of the victims talks about in the documentary, sent an explicit photo of himself to an 11-year-old girl, like emailed it to her. And then there were other victims. He went to prison as well. But so it's so tragic that, again, it's a pattern, and that they were protected and were able to still work with children. That's so disgusting, putting children in harm's way. And then other discrepancies, racial discrimination, gender discrimination. Those two female writers who came forward talking about their experience working on the first season of The Amanda Show, how they split a salary, how they were demeaned, doing degrading things for the sake of not wanting to seem uptight and just trying to carve a path for themselves in the industry because it was their first job as writers in the industry. And one of them, I believe it was Christy then, who says at one point, that's why only her and I are talking to you and not more people. That obviously there were more people that did not come forward because perhaps they're still working in the industry, whatever reasons they have for not wanting to be part of the documentary, but that it's more so catered to the people who are making them money at the exploitation of children. So it's so disgusting. And then talking about racial discrimination, Black actors sharing how like they'd be stereotyped characters, for example, and that they didn't feel safe coming forward, or for the parents to notice that but didn't feel safe voicing that because then they would become the problem, and then ultimately several of them, it turned out, were fired. It was so devastating seeing Raquel, and I remember her from season 1 of The Amanda Show, and then her saying by the end of the documentary that she doesn't even give a thought that her answer, if she would allow her kids to be part of the business, is without even a thought, no. It's just truly, truly disgusting. And then Dan Schneider, of course, put out, of course, because it's so calculated and manipulative from his perspective, where he sits down with a former actor on the original series of iCarly, Boogie, who played Tebow, and Alexa Nicholas, who was featured in the documentary, protested Nickelodeon, and also shared her thoughts on Dan's calculated apology, that it's all just still downplaying and not truly address. It's only like cherry picking the things he wanted to address. It's devastating because it's like, from my perspective, obviously, this is just me as a fan of these shows, who grew up watching these shows, and as someone who's still trying to make it in the television industry. It's infuriating because I think to myself, like, is this all even worth it? And obviously I know this is, very unfortunate extreme circumstances in this case that were highlighted in this documentary. But again, this is a pattern in Hollywood, and not just in Hollywood, but in other industries. But obviously, again, focusing on the documentary, the content of that from my perspective, I already know so far on my own journey that it's extremely competitive, there's so much rejection, and that like you have to just keep going, keep at it, otherwise you're not going to improve, you're not going to get anywhere if you don't. You gotta, understandably, you gotta network, you gotta do all these other things that are part of the business. And then obviously every writer's room is different, and this is obviously very unfortunate circumstances that these former actors went through, and so disgusting. I can't get over like all the pedophilia shit. So fucked up. Oh my fucking God. My skin is crawling just thinking of that. But what truly broke me in particular was when Drake Bell's father said that, he didn't like Brian Peck hanging around his son. It was very unsettling to him. And that Brian Peck drove a wedge between Drake Bell and his father. And so then Brian Peck ended up manipulating the mother. And you not to like recap it all, you can watch it if you haven't. Obviously, it's streaming on Max, the 4-part documentary. But what truly broke me was that At the time, he didn't know that when Brian Peck was arrested, that Drake was the victim of the sexual assault, the ongoing sexual assaults, that it was ongoing. It wasn't just one isolated incident. And even had been, that's still traumatic. But nevertheless, Drake said it only got worse and worse and worse. And that's so devastating. But it's so tragic seeing that Drake Bell's father, when he did find out that he still lives with that pain to this day, that just broke me. And then even Drake sharing that this was obviously his first time publicly sharing his story, and then having to see all these people having written letters in support of Brian Peck. And obviously that didn't change the abuse he went through, and that he has to live with that, and they have to live with that, knowing that they're supporting this monster. It's disgusting, because again, this monster who knew how to manipulate people, obviously. But so what was healing, though, to me was at the end of the documentary when Drake and his father, that whatever fraught relationship they may have had, that there was a path to healing and forgiveness in their journey as father and son. And then just Drake's father assuring him better days are ahead, and then Drake says, yeah, I keep hearing that, and Drake's father says, yeah, keep listening to it. It's true. It's like, despite all of this traumatic shit, you still have to believe that there is goodness and justice will prevail. And so for me, it's just very tragic seeing how on Dan Schneider's shows that it was this hostile work environment where people didn't feel safe to come forward in fear of losing their jobs in that case. And again, that's not just unique to Hollywood, and that's what's so sad. It's like, hopefully this all coming to light does create positive change moving forward. It's definitely a step in the right direction, not silencing people, That's the worst thing. So that's my big takeaway, and hoping that this is now, for everyone who came forward and shared their stories on this documentary, that helps with their healing process, with the trauma they went through, the negative experiences they went through. And Drake Bell also, he put out a song that he wrote about these experiences called I Kind of Relate. And it starts with a young actor reading a script, going into a trailer, and then it's him in a car with a whole bloody face, which was in reference to a car accident he had gotten into when he was younger, and then him at a meeting, perhaps AA, perhaps a therapy session, and then him going off to Mexico, finding love there, as he sings about. And then a noticeable part that recreates the Drake and Josh set. And there's even a line in the song that references the Drake and Josh theme song, and he's playing the guitar. It's a great music video. And I hope that him putting that song out there, I'm sure it has helped with this healing process as well, because taking all of your pain and anguish and turning it into art, using it for creativity, that helps with the healing process. So that's very commendable of him sharing this trauma he went through, and the people who failed him, and each of these actors and writers and former employees who came forward and shared their experiences. I commend all of them. Like, even just things that in comparison to the predators and the sexual abuse is horrible, but still, like, even other minor discretions which are still horrible, like Katrina Johnson, for example, hearing that someone had said, like, oh, she's getting fat, they already have a fat one, she can't get fatty. That's fucking disgusting. Because any abuse of any kind, any discriminatory behavior of any kind, when I get worked up, apologies, let me take a moment, that's so horrible. And again, the gender discrimination, because again, I'm relating to it because I am a woman, and I've already seen, like, I've experienced my own forms of sexism. Everyone can relate in some sense to, tragically, if you can relate to some form of discrimination, whether for your race, anything, you know what I mean? That's obviously not okay. Just truly shocking and disgusting. So again, like what Alexa Nicholas says in the documentary, let's make it so there's never another Dan Schneider again, as another abusive person who contributed to the hostile work environment and didn't make it safe for children and for employees, that they could be heard and not in fear of losing their jobs. And that this institution, like Nickelodeon, in this case, like trying to like have people sign NDAs. Jeanette McCurdy, for example, mentions that in her book, that she turned down the hush money from Nickelodeon because she wanted to be able to share her story on her own terms. And for that too, the things she went through. That book was, oh my fucking God, it was tragic, the things she went through. Namely, the abuse from her mother. But again, not to like, veer off so much. I could talk about the book perhaps at another time, but that was really, like, that one made me cry so much too. Similarly with Britney Spears' memoir, the abuse she went through at the hands of her father and so many people who failed her in the industry. That's another example, of course. So much fucked up shit. And what it all boils down to, the connections with all of that, is that it's like not seeing them as human beings, but as cash cows. It's like, well, we're making money off of this. And because Alexa Nicholas has said that they don't make residuals whatsoever, they don't make a dime off of it, but Nickelodeon still continues to make money off of it in the form of these shows, I should say. And then obviously the reboots. And I've talked about, like, I've watched the reboots, the Zoe 102 reboot, like all these things that bank on nostalgia. And obviously that's not exclusive to Nickelodeon. Like all these shows that got rebooted because it banks on nostalgia, making money. I get it. At the end of the day, they're trying to make money. It's an industry. It's a business. But putting all that aside, again, talking about people with feelings and it's just not, in that case, feeling safe. And, it's so fucked up. Poor Drake Bell, what he went through. I can't fucking imagine. Oh my fucking God. That's disgusting. That is horrific. And obviously then what led to his self-destruction, which he mentions as well, alcoholism, substance abuse, tragically. Oh my God. So truly, I really hope I think it is. It's, on the path to healing, certainly, on the path to positive change. Let's be better. Listen to survivors. Make it a safe haven for people to come forward and not have to be silenced. Honestly, in this moment, I can't look at Nickelodeon the same way again. In this moment, I'm just like, ugh. Even also, like, just, again, compared to the truly disgusting, horrible things with the sexual abuse, even other discrepancies that are discussed in the documentary of adult jokes, which that's not actually small things. Like, they talk about a lot with Ariana Grande, for example, being exploited, like all of the suggestive shit and the cum shot joke. Like, in hindsight then, I'm like, ugh, my skin's crawling right now. Again, minors, children. Ugh, fucking gross. And then adults writing it and then all the execs approving it and whatever. The on-air dare stuff too. I remember that, like, I had totally forgotten that until they brought it up in the documentary, the on-air dare stuff. And again, like, as a kid version of Fear Factor. That's horrible that they had to do this, like, for what? For entertainment? That's so gross. And I remember that, like, specifically, like, the worm one. I was like, ew, I remember this. The peanut butter thing, so fucked up. Ugh. And the innuendos of, like, phallic imagery and things like that. And obviously, like, that's not exclusive to Nickelodeon or, like, kids shows in general, that there are more adult jokes here and there. But, like, blatant stuff like that. And also with the man show, Penelope Taint, the name Taint. Sure, different spelling, but, as one of the women says in the documentary, what taint? Ugh. Ugh, so gross. I'm cringing because it's just all this, in a sense, grooming, and it goes back to just making money. Like, well, he makes hit after hit, and then it took until 2018 that they parted ways, Dan Schneider and Nickelodeon. It's so fucked up. All the stuff about Amanda Bynes and, like, the conservatorship with her parents, the abuse she went through, clearly. And obviously, like, her substance abuse, she went through so fucking much. It's so devastating. Poor Amanda Bynes. Because I looked up to her as a kid. Like, I wanted to, like, be her. As a kid, I can say, as a kid, I wanted to be on all that. I remember there was a contest to try to be on all that, but I never did any of that stuff. Like, I didn't apply to it or anything because I remember as a kid thinking, like, well, I'm not talented enough I'm enough funny, whatever. But also, I can't even imagine, like, auditioning for something like that. Even just, like, the rejection and the long hours. So much stuff that needs to be changed in the hands of people in power who can make positive change for the better, to treat people like humans as they deserve, like, ooh. So it was very heavy, to say the least, watching this documentary. I was weeping by the end because I couldn't help but connect certain things with my own personal trauma that I'm still working through. I've discussed it on this podcast in the episode Bailey, if you care to listen to that. If you haven't, if whatever, I'm not going to revisit that at this moment because it's re-triggering going down that path, but it still haunts me, my trauma, what I went through as a victim of a scam. I'll just say, I'm getting like my body language right now. I'm like, ooh, take a breath. I'm in the present. I have to remind myself things like that because it sucks. And people close to me have went through severely, severely traumatic shit. Again, I'm not going to get into all of that, obviously, but it's all connected in the sense with this documentary, with what these people went through. These brave people who came forward to share their experiences, again, as I've said multiple times now. So I'm grateful for this documentary and for the people who worked on it, who it was, very devastating, very harrowing, but again, it's a step in the right direction of people sharing these stories. And so we can only go up from here, as we can all hope. The Me Too movement, as they mentioned, that certainly created positive change of getting predators behind bars, as they should have been a long time ago, being held accountable. Disgusting. Oh my, you know what I mean? Like all the fucking abuse. Oh God. Like all the tragic, terrible shit in the world, obviously. But yeah, but again, just like with Nickelodeon, it's forever tainted, pardon the pun. That word is in my head now. And, they touch on other stuff like the feet shit. And then you look back on it in hindsight, like, yeah, there's a lot of feet jokes. Fucking gross. I've noticed patterns personally, like a lot of prison jokes in Dan Schneider's shows. Whatever. Not to just keep like going on and on about his shows, but because again, ultimately with those shows, like, I know at the end of the day, they're there to make you laugh. Whatever. And they do. And like I've said, I've revisited them. I've talked about them on this podcast, like Victorious, iCarly. But what I'm getting at is that let this be truly a step in the right direction of eliminating any kind of abuse and hostility and negative, toxic work environments, allowing people to be heard despite their race, despite their gender, to be treated equally, to be treated fairly, to be treated like a human being. Simple as that. So yeah, to echo Drake Bell's dad's, I forget his first name, so I'm just saying Drake Bell's dad's words at the end of the documentary, better days are ahead. Better days are ahead. I wholeheartedly agree. So thank you for listening. Until next time, write what you love.